I never imagined that the man who would return my faith in love would arrive in servant's clothing, smelling of leather and hay. But then, I had learned long ago that Providence cares nothing for our expectations, only for the truth we are too afraid to see.
A is for apple.
The morning he appeared at the
B
kitchen door
is
of
for
Hartley
boy.
Cottage,
C
I was kneading
is for
bread
cat.
with flour-dusted hands, and Thomas was upstairs practicing his letters. 5 years had passed since the night I fled Ashford Manor with a newborn infant wrapped in my shawl, since the accusations that stripped me of my position and very nearly my sanity. 5 years since I became a thief in the eyes of society, though what I had stolen was not silver or jewels, but something far more precious, a child's life, a future that powerful hands had tried to extinguish before it could truly begin. The knock was firm, but not aggressive, the sound of someone who knew how to announce themselves without demanding. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the door to find a man of perhaps 30 years, tall and lean with dark hair that fell slightly too long across his brow. His clothing marked him as a laborer, rough wool and worn leather, but his bearing suggested something else entirely, a straightness to his spine, a directness to his gaze that spoke of authority long practiced and poorly concealed. He said his name was William Gray, that he had heard I might need assistance with the property, that he was looking for honest work and a place to lay his head. His voice was low and measured, educated despite his apparent station, and there was something in his gray eyes that made me hesitate, not from fear, but from recognition of a shared understanding of loss. I told him I had little money for wages, that the cottage was small and the work would be hard, but he simply nodded and said that room and board would suffice, that he was not looking to profit, but to atone. I did not ask what sins required such penance. I had my own to carry. He took the small room above the stable, barely more than a loft with a narrow bed and a single window overlooking the garden. Within days, he had repaired the fence I had been meaning to mend for months, cleared the overgrown path to the main road, and restored the water pump that had been giving me trouble since winter. He worked from dawn until dusk, with a focused intensity that suggested he was running from something, or perhaps toward it, and he asked for nothing beyond the simple meals I provided and the occasional conversation in the evening when Thomas had gone to bed. Thomas, my beautiful, bright boy who knew nothing of dukes or duchesses, of inheritance or conspiracy, who believed I was his mother in truth and not merely in devotion. At 5 years old, he had his father's dark hair and gray eyes, his mother's delicate features and gentle disposition, and a mind that absorbed knowledge like parched earth drinks rain. I had taught him to read and write, to calculate numbers and identify the stars, to be kind and curious and brave. And every day I lived in terror that someone would come to take him from me, that the lies I had told to protect him would unravel and leave us both destroyed. William Gray watched Thomas with an intensity that troubled me. Not the predatory interest of someone with ill intent, but something deeper and more complicated, a hunger that seemed to border on grief. He would pause in his work when Thomas played in the garden, his hands stilling on whatever task occupied them, his expression distant and pained. Once, I found him standing outside the cottage at dusk, simply watching through the window as I helped Thomas prepare for bed, and when I asked if something was wrong, he turned to me with eyes that glistened in the fading light and said only that the boy reminded him of someone he had lost. I did not press him further. We all have our ghosts. As autumn deepened and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter, William became less a hired hand and more a fixture of our small household. He carved wooden animals for Thomas, showed him how to identify animal tracks in the soft earth, taught him to whistle using a blade of grass. He repaired the roof before the rains came, insulated the windows against the cold, chopped enough firewood to see us through until spring. And in the evenings, after Thomas slept, we would sit by the fire and talk of inconsequential things, the weather, the harvest, the neighbors in the village, carefully avoiding the subjects that truly mattered, who we were, where we came from, what we were hiding. But I was not foolish enough to believe such careful distance could last forever. There were moments when his attention would drift to some object in the cottage, a book, a piece of fabric, a particular pattern in the wallpaper, and I would see recognition flicker across his features before he masked it. There were nights when I heard him pacing in the loft above the stable, restless and wakeful, as though sleep offered no escape from whatever tormented him. And there was the way he looked at Thomas, not merely with affection, but with a possessiveness that both comforted and alarmed me, as though he had some claim to the child that transcended our invented relationship. It was late October when everything began to shift, to crack along fault lines I had not known existed. Thomas fell ill with a fever that would not break, his small body burning with heat that terrified me with its intensity. I sat beside his bed for 2 days and nights, bathing his forehead with cool water, forcing small sips of tea past his cracked lips, praying to a God I was not certain listened to women like me, women who had stolen children and destroyed their own reputations in the name of a greater good. William appeared at the cottage door on the second night with a doctor from the village, a kind elderly man who examined Thomas with gentle efficiency and prescribed a tincture that would ease the fever. I had no money to pay him, but William pressed coins into his hand with a natural authority that belied his servant's clothing, and the doctor accepted them without question, as though it were perfectly normal for a chauffeur to carry such wealth. After the doctor left, William stayed. He sat beside me in the small bedroom, his presence solid and comforting in the flickering candlelight, and when I finally broke down in exhausted tears, terrified that I would lose this child I had sacrificed everything to protect, he gathered me against his chest and held me while I sobbed. His embrace was not familiar, but it felt inevitable, as though we had been moving toward this moment since the day he knocked on my door, and in my grief and exhaustion, I did not pull away. He said my name, Eleanor, softly, almost reverently, and I realized with a start that I had never told him my given name, only that I was Miss Hartley. When I pulled back to look at him, to ask how he knew, his expression was raw with an emotion I could not quite name, something that looked like anguish and hope tangled together. Before I could speak, Thomas stirred in the bed, his fever finally breaking, his eyes fluttering open with weak recognition. He looked at William and smiled, that simple, trusting smile of a child who knows himself loved, and whispered a single word that changed everything. "Papa!" William went rigid beside me, his breath catching in his throat. I opened my mouth to correct Thomas, to explain that he was confused by the fever, but William was already moving to the bedside, kneeling beside the small figure with a tenderness that made my heart ache. He touched Thomas's cheek with trembling fingers, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and when he spoke his voice was thick with emotion. "Yes," he said, "yes, I am here." And in that moment, with the candlelight casting shadows across his face, I saw not William Gray, the humble chauffeur, but someone else entirely. Someone I had not seen in 5 years, but whose features were etched in my memory with perfect clarity. The high cheekbones, the strong jaw, the particular gray of his eyes that I saw reflected every day in the child I had raised as my own. Alexander Hartwell, the Duke of Ashford, had returned. And he knew. He knew everything. I stood frozen beside the bed, my mind racing through implications and consequences, through years of carefully constructed lies, now collapsing like a house built on sand. He had been here for weeks, watching us, working beside me, learning the shape of the life I had built from the ruins of his family's cruelty. He had known who I was, who Thomas was, and he had said nothing, revealed nothing, simply worked and waited as though time itself could heal wounds that ran so deep. He turned to look at me then, still kneeling beside his son, and in his expression I saw not anger but gratitude, not accusation but awe. There were tears on his cheeks, tracking through the dust and exhaustion that lined his face, and when he spoke my name again, it was a question and a plea and a promise all woven together. "Eleanor," he said, "what have you done?" It was not what I expected, Not rage at my theft, not fury at my deception, not the cold dismissal I had feared for 5 years. Instead, there was wonder in his voice, as though he could not comprehend the magnitude of what I had accomplished, the life I had preserved against impossible odds. "I saved him," I whispered, my own tears beginning to fall. "They wanted him gone, your mother and your brother. They paid the midwife to say he was stillborn, to make him disappear. I could not let that happen. I could not let them erase him as though he had never existed." The words tumbled out in a rush, 5 years of silence breaking like a dam, and Alexander, listened without interrupting, his hand still resting gently on Thomas's sleeping form. I told him everything. The night of the birth, the horror of realizing what was planned, the desperate flight through the manor's servants' passages with a newborn infant hidden beneath my cloak, the false accusations of theft that followed, designed to discredit me should I ever dare to speak the truth. The years of hiding, of poverty, of teaching myself to be a mother to a child who was not mine by blood, but by every choice that mattered. When I finished, the room was silent except for Thomas's gentle breathing and the crackle of the dying fire. Alexander remained kneeling beside the bed, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with emotion I could not fully interpret. Finally, he looked up at me, and the expression on his face was one of such profound anguish and gratitude that it took my breath away. "You gave me back my son," he said simply. "You gave me back everything." But the weight of what came next hung between us like a blade suspended by a thread. He was the Duke of Ashford, one of the most powerful men in England, and I was the woman who had stolen from him, lied to him, hidden his heir from him for 5 years. The law was on his side, society was on his side, and every convention and expectation demanded that he take Thomas and cast me aside, just another servant who had overstepped her bounds. I waited for him to say it, to explain that while he was grateful, I could no longer be part of Thomas's life, that his son needed a proper upbringing in the world to which he had been born. I waited for the kindly dismissal, the generous pension, the gentle erasure of my existence from the narrative of the Duke's miraculous recovery of his lost heir. But Alexander Hartwell did not speak those words. Instead, he rose from beside the bed and crossed the small room until he stood before me, close enough that I could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, the gray that had crept into his dark hair, the weight of his own 5 years of grief and guilt pressing down upon him. He reached out slowly, giving me time to step away, and when I did not, he cupped my face in his calloused hands, hands that had held hammers and chopped wood and mended fences, hands that bore the marks of honest labor undertaken in disguise. "I came back to destroy them," he said quietly. "My mother, my brother, everyone who conspired to murder my child. I returned to Ashford in secret to gather evidence, to build a case that would see them hanged for what they tried to do. But I did not expect to find this. I did not expect to find you, to find him, to find that all my rage and grief had been for nothing because he was alive, because you had saved him." His thumb brushed away a tear from my cheek, the gesture unbearably gentle. "I have watched you for weeks, Eleanor. I have seen how you love him, how you have sacrificed everything to give him a life of safety and joy. I have seen your strength and your courage, and I have fallen in love with you in the process, hopelessly and completely. And I do not know what to do with this truth except lay it before you and hope that you do not turn me away." The words hung in the air between us, impossible and inevitable, a confession that changed the architecture of everything I had believed about my future. A duke did not fall in love with a disgraced governess. A man of his station did not offer his heart to a woman who lived in a cottage with a leaking roof and flour permanently embedded under her fingernails. These things did not happen in the world I knew, the world of rigid hierarchies and inviolable rules. But perhaps we had both stepped outside that world the moment we chose to protect Thomas above all else. Perhaps we had forfeited our places in society's careful order when we decided that love and truth mattered more than convention and appearance. I looked up at him, at this man who had returned from grief disguised as someone else, who had labored beside me without revealing himself, who had fallen in love with the life I had built from the ashes of his family's cruelty. And I realized that I had been falling in love with him too, with William Gray, the chauffeur who carved wooden horses and mended fences, not knowing that he was also Alexander Hartwell, the Duke who had every right to take everything from me. "What happens now?" I whispered. He smiled then, a sad, uncertain smile that made him look younger than his years. "I do not know," he admitted, "but I think we face it together, you and I and Thomas. I think we find a way to build something new from the ruins of what was destroyed. I think we fight for each other the way you fought for him, with everything we have. Consequences be damned." It was a promise and a question, an offer that terrified me with its implications. To stand beside him would mean facing his family, facing society, facing the scandal and judgment that would inevitably follow. It would mean risking everything I had built for the chance at something more, something that included not just survival, but genuine happiness, genuine love. I thought of Thomas sleeping peacefully in the next room, the fever broken, his father returned to him in a way he could not yet fully understand. I thought of the years ahead, the challenges we would face, the battles we would have to fight to protect what we had found in this small cottage, far from the glittering world of estates and titles. And I thought of the man standing before me, holding my face in his work-roughened hands, offering me not just gratitude, but partnership, not just appreciation, but devotion. I took a breath and made my choice. The same choice I had made 5 years ago in a dark hallway with a newborn infant in my arms, the choice to fight for love over convention, for truth over appearance, for the family we could become over the one we were expected to be. "Together," I said. "We face it together." And when he kissed me, gentle and reverent in the candlelight, it felt like a beginning rather than an ending, like the first page of a story we would write ourselves, no matter who tried to tear it from our hands. The morning after Alexander's revelation, I woke to find Thomas sitting at the kitchen table with his father, both of them bent over a sheet of paper covered in careful drawings of horses. The early light streamed through the window, catching the dust motes in the air, and for a moment I simply stood in the doorway watching them, marveling at how perfectly Thomas's small dark head matched the angle of Alexander's, how their laughter had the same cadence, how 5 years of separation had not diminished the invisible thread that bound them together. Alexander looked up and saw me, and the smile that crossed his face was so unguarded, so full of simple joy, that it made my heart ache. This was not the cold, distant Duke of Ashford I remembered from my time at the manor, the man who had seemed carved from marble and duty. This was someone new, or perhaps someone old, a version of himself he had buried beneath grief and titles and the weight of expectations that had nearly destroyed his family. Thomas scrambled down from his chair and ran to me, wrapping his thin arms around my waist with the enthusiastic affection of a child who had recovered from illness and wanted nothing more than to return to the business of living. He told me that Papa, he said Papa now without hesitation, had promised to teach him to ride properly, that they would go to the village and buy peppermints, that everything was going to be wonderful from now on. His innocence was both beautiful and terrifying, for he could not yet understand the complexity of what lay ahead, the battles that would have to be fought to preserve this fragile happiness. Over breakfast, Alexander and I talked carefully, aware of Thomas listening even as he played with his wooden animals on the floor. We spoke in the coded language that adults use around children, discussing plans and possibilities without naming the dangers that lurked beneath them. He told me that he had been gathering evidence against his mother and brother for months, that he had witnesses who would testify to the conspiracy, that he intended to bring charges that would strip them of their positions and see justice done. but his voice was heavy with the knowledge that such a course would bring scandal crashing down upon all of us, that the revelations would destroy what remained of his family's reputation and quite possibly his own standing in society. I asked him what he wanted, truly wanted, beneath all the questions of justice and revenge. He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on Thomas. And when he spoke, his answer was simple and devastating. I want my son to know his father. I want him to grow up without fear or shame. I want him to inherit what is rightfully his, not because of the title, but because he deserves to know where he came from. And I want you beside me, Eleanor, as my wife, if you will have me, as the mother Thomas already knows you to be, as the woman who saved everything worth saving in my life. The proposal was so direct, so lacking in the romantic flourishes one might expect, that it took me a moment to fully comprehend what he had said. Marriage, to a duke, to a man I had served as governess, whose household I had fled in disgrace, whose family had tried to destroy me. The impossibility of it was staggering, and yet he spoke of it as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though love and gratitude and shared purpose were sufficient foundation for a union that would scandalize every drawing room in England. I told him I needed time to think, that the magnitude of what he was offering terrified me, that I did not know if I could survive the scrutiny and judgment that would come with such a choice. He nodded, accepting my hesitation without protest, and said only that he would wait as long as I needed, that he had already waited 5 years and could manage a few more days or weeks or months if that was what I required. But time, I was learning, was not something we could count on having in abundance. 3 days after Alexander's revelation, a carriage arrived at the cottage bearing the crest of Ashford Manor. I saw it coming up the narrow road and felt my blood turn to ice, every instinct screaming at me to take Thomas and run, to disappear into the countryside as I had done once before. But Alexander placed a steady hand on my shoulder and said quietly that running was over, that we would face whatever came together, that he would not allow anyone to harm us ever again. The woman who emerged from the carriage was tall and elegant, dressed in black silk, despite the years that had passed since her supposed mourning should have ended. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford, Alexander's mother, a woman whose cold beauty had always seemed to me more weapon than gift. She looked at the cottage with barely concealed distaste, at me with open contempt, and at Alexander with an expression I could not quite read, something between shock and fury and perhaps the faintest hint of fear. She said his name, Alexander, as though testing whether he was real or apparition, and he stepped forward with the bearing of the duke he was, no longer disguising himself as William Grey, the humble chauffeur. He told her he had returned, that he knew everything, that her conspiracy had failed. His voice was cold and controlled, each word precisely chosen and delivered with the authority of someone who held all the power in this exchange. She recovered quickly, her composure settling back into place like armor. She said she did not know what lies he had been told, that if he had concerns about his son's death, he should direct them to the proper authorities, that she had nothing to hide and everything to lose from false accusations. But her eyes betrayed her, darting to me, and then to the cottage door where Thomas had appeared, curious about the grand carriage and the elegant lady who had arrived. The moment she saw Thomas, her face went white. All her careful composure cracked, and I saw naked shock followed by calculation, the rapid assessment of someone realizing their carefully constructed world was collapsing. Thomas stood in the doorway with his dark hair and gray eyes, an exact miniature of his father, undeniably alive and undeniably the heir she had tried to erase. She demanded to know what this meant, who had dared to interfere, how this child had survived when she had been assured. And then she stopped herself, realizing too late that her words were a confession. Alexander smiled, a cold and terrible expression that held no warmth, and said that she had just admitted to conspiracy to murder an infant, that he had witnesses to corroborate the plot, that she would face the full weight of the law for what she had attempted. But then he offered her a choice. She could leave England, retire to the continent with a modest pension, and never return, never contact Thomas or attempt to influence his life in any way. In exchange, he would not bring charges, would not drag the family name through the courts, would allow her to retain some dignity in exile rather than face the scaffold. Or she could fight, and he would destroy her utterly, would use every resource at his disposal to see her hanged for attempted infanticide and conspiracy to defraud the succession. I watched her face as she weighed her options, saw the fury and pride warring with the instinct for self-preservation. She looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time, and I saw in her expression a grudging acknowledgement of what I had done, of the courage or foolishness it had taken to steal away her grandson and raise him in defiance of her will. "You," she said to me, her voice dripping with disdain. "You were always too clever for your own good, Miss Hartley, too observant, too willful, too quick to believe yourself equal to your betters. I should have dismissed you the moment you arrived, but Alexander's late wife insisted you were competent, and I allowed sentiment to cloud my judgment." She turned back to her son, and for just a moment I saw something like genuine emotion cross her features, something that might have been regret or grief, or simply exhaustion. "You would truly do this?" she asked quietly. "You would cast out your own mother, destroy your family's name for the sake of a servant girl and a child who should never have survived?" Alexander's response was immediate and unwavering. He told her that she had ceased to be his mother the night she tried to murder his son, that the family name meant nothing if it was built on such evil, and that yes, he would choose Eleanor and Thomas over her without hesitation or doubt. His words were brutal in their honesty, and I saw her flinch as though he had struck her. She agreed to his terms, not graciously, not with any show of remorse, but with the cold pragmatism of someone who knew when they had lost. She would leave within the month, would establish herself in Italy or France, would never return to England or attempt to contact Thomas. In exchange, Alexander would tell society that she had chosen retirement abroad for her health, would maintain the fiction that preserved what remained of the family's dignity. Before she left, she looked at Thomas one last time, and I saw something complicated in her expression. Not love exactly, but perhaps recognition of what might have been had she not allowed ambition and cruelty to override every gentler instinct. Then she climbed back into her carriage and was gone, disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust and the rattle of wheels, taking with her the last remnants of the old order that had nearly destroyed us all. Alexander stood beside me watching until the carriage vanished from sight, and then he exhaled slowly, as though he had been holding his breath for years. He turned to me and said simply that it was done, that we were free, that nothing now stood between us and the life we chose to build. But I knew it was not quite that simple. There was still his brother, the current heir, who stood to lose everything when Thomas's existence became known. There was still society, which would look with suspicion and scandal upon a duke who married his son's former governess, a woman who had been dismissed for theft and lived in poverty for 5 years. There was still the question of how we would explain Thomas's sudden appearance, how we would manage the transition from obscurity to inheritance, how we would protect him from those who might resent his claim or seek to use him for their own purposes. These concerns I voiced to Alexander that evening after Thomas had gone to bed, sitting beside him in the small parlor with tea grown cold between us. He listened patiently, and when I finished, he took my hand in his and said that yes, these were real challenges, but they were ones we would face together, that he had not come this far only to let fear dictate our choices now. He told me then about the years after he thought Thomas had died, about the grief that had consumed him so completely that he could barely function, about his retreat from society and the long darkness that followed. He spoke of his wife, Catherine, with tenderness and sorrow, acknowledging that their marriage had been one of duty more than passion, but that she had deserved far better than the death she suffered. He confessed that he had blamed himself for her loss, for not protecting her better during the pregnancy, for not recognizing the danger that lurked within his own household. It was his guilt, he said, that had kept him away for so long, that had made him believe he did not deserve to return, to reclaim his title and position, to live anything resembling a normal life. But then he had received word, through channels he did not fully explain, that there were questions about Thomas's death, inconsistencies that suggested something more sinister than simple tragedy. He had returned in disguise to investigate, expecting to find evidence of murder that he could use to destroy those responsible, never imagining that he would find his son alive. "And you," he said softly, looking at me with an expression that made my breath catch. "You were the miracle I did not know to hope for, Eleanor. Not just because you saved Thomas, but because you showed me that love is not always gentle or convenient or socially acceptable. Sometimes it is fierce and defiant and willing to burn down the world to protect what matters. You taught me that through your actions, through your courage. And I fell in love with that strength before I ever fell in love with you." His words undid something in me, some last defense I had been holding against the reality of what was growing between us. I had been telling myself that his gratitude would fade, that once the initial relief of finding Thomas alive had passed, he would see clearly how impossible a union between us would be. But the way he looked at me in that moment was not about gratitude or relief or temporary emotion. It was about seeing me fully, understanding what I had done and why, and choosing me anyway, choosing us, regardless of what it would cost him. I told him yes, I would marry him. Yes, I would stand beside him as we fought for Thomas's rightful place. Yes, I would face whatever scandal and judgment came our way, because the alternative, a life without him and Thomas, without this strange and precious family we had somehow become, was unthinkable. He kissed me then, not gently as he had the first time, but with a hunger and relief that spoke of years of loneliness finally ending. And when we broke apart, both of us breathing hard, he smiled and said that we would do this properly, that he would not have anyone say we had acted improperly or without honor, that there would be a proper courtship, even if it was somewhat backwards given that we were already living under the same roof and raising a child together. The absurdity of it made me laugh, and he joined me, and for a moment we were simply two people who had found each other against impossible odds, who had chosen love over convention and would face the consequences together. The next morning, Alexander rode to the village and returned with the solicitor, a discreet man who had served the Ashford family for decades and who listened to our story with growing astonishment. He confirmed that Thomas was indeed the legitimate heir, that his survival and rightful place could not be disputed once the proper documents were filed. He advised caution in how we revealed the situation to society, suggested a gradual approach that would minimize scandal while establishing the truth of Thomas's identity and my role in saving him. It would take time, he warned us. There would be investigations, questions, skepticism from those who benefited from the current arrangement or who simply enjoyed creating difficulties. But the law was on our side, and more importantly, the truth was on our side. And in the end, these things mattered more than convenience or convention. Over the following weeks, we began the delicate process of reintroducing Alexander to society and preparing Thomas for the change that was coming. We traveled to London, the three of us, and took up residence not in Ashford House, which was still occupied by Alexander's brother, but in a smaller townhouse that offered more privacy and safety. There, carefully and deliberately, Alexander began to tell his story, to reveal that he had not been dead or lost, but merely in retreat, that he had discovered his son had survived, that everything was about to change. The reactions were predictable: shock, scandal, delight at the drama, suspicion of me and my motives, questions about the timing and circumstances. But Alexander faced each challenge with calm determination, producing evidence, introducing Thomas to key members of society, making it clear that he would not be swayed or shamed into abandoning his son or his chosen path. And through it all, he kept me beside him, not hidden away as some embarrassing necessity, but present and acknowledged, making clear his intention to marry me despite the raised eyebrows and whispered gossip. Some were appalled, others were intrigued. A very few, were genuinely happy for us, seeing past the scandal to the truth of what we had accomplished and what we meant to each other. It was exhausting and exhilarating and terrifying all at once. This slow emergence from the shadows into the harsh light of society's judgment. But every night, when the performances and politics were over, we would return to the townhouse and sit with Thomas, reading him stories or playing simple games, reminding ourselves why we were fighting so hard for this impossible future. One evening, as I was putting Thomas to bed, he asked me if I was really going to marry Papa, if I was going to become a real duchess like the ones in his storybooks. I told him yes, if he was comfortable with that, if he was happy about it. He thought for a moment, his young face serious, and then he said that he was happy, that he had always wanted a mama and a papa both, and that he thought we would be a very good family together. His simple faith in us, his uncomplicated acceptance of this new reality, was both humbling and inspiring. He did not care about titles or scandal or social complications. He cared that he was loved, that he was safe, that the people around him were genuine in their affection for him. In that, he was wiser than all the society matrons and title-obsessed aristocrats who spent their time judging and calculating and maneuvering for advantage. I kissed his forehead and told him he was right, that we would be a very good family, and as I left his room, I found Alexander waiting in the hallway, having heard our conversation. He pulled me into his arms without a word, and we stood there in the quiet house, holding each other, gathering strength for the battles still to come. Because we both knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Alexander's brother had not yet been confronted, had not yet been forced to relinquish his position as heir, and when that happened, the real fight would begin. But we were ready, or as ready as we could be, armed with truth and love and an unwavering determination to protect the family we had fought so hard to create. The confrontation with Richard Hartwell, Alexander's younger brother and the man who had believed himself heir to the dukedom for 5 years, came on a gray morning in late November. Alexander had arranged the meeting at the solicitor's office rather than at Ashford House, a neutral ground that suggested this was business rather than family, law rather than sentiment. I insisted on being present despite Alexander's concerns, and Thomas we left with a trusted nurse, shielding him from what we knew would be an ugly scene. Richard arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably as always, his fair hair perfectly arranged, his expression one of mild curiosity rather than concern. He had not yet grasped the full implications of Alexander's return, had convinced himself that whatever complications had arisen could be managed, smoothed over, contained within the bounds of acceptable scandal. He greeted his brother with cautious warmth, acknowledged me with barely concealed disdain, and settled into his chair with the confidence of someone who believed he still held all the advantages. Alexander did not waste time on pleasantries. He told Richard directly that Thomas was alive, that he was the legitimate heir, that everything Richard had assumed about his future was built on a lie and a crime. He laid out the evidence methodically. The testimony of the midwife who had been paid to declare the child stillborn, the records of payments from their mother's private accounts, the witnesses who had seen the conspiracy unfold. He spoke without emotion, presenting facts rather than accusations, letting the truth speak for itself. I watched Richard's face as comprehension dawned, as the confident mask cracked and revealed first disbelief, then fury, then something that looked almost like panic. He demanded to see the child, to have independent verification, to understand how this was possible when he had been told, when everyone had been told, that the infant had not survived. His voice rose with each question, and I could see the calculation behind his eyes. The rapid assessment of options and strategies, the desperate search for some way to refute what was being presented. But there was no refutation possible. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and most damning of all, Thomas himself existed, a living, breathing child who bore the Hartwell features so unmistakably that no one who saw him could doubt his parentage. Richard's entire claim to the succession rested on Thomas's death, and that foundation had just been utterly destroyed. He turned on me then, his composure shattering completely. He accused me of orchestrating the entire thing, of stealing the child and hiding him away deliberately to create leverage, of manipulating Alexander's grief and gratitude for my own advancement. His words were vicious and calculated, designed to wound and to plant doubt, to suggest that I was the true villain of this story rather than the woman who had saved an innocent life. Alexander's response was immediate and uncompromising. He stood and told Richard that he would not tolerate such attacks, that I had acted with courage and honor while Richard and their mother had conspired to commit murder, that there was no moral equivalence between my choices and theirs. His voice was cold with fury, and for the first time I saw the full weight of his authority, the power that came not just from his title, but from absolute certainty in the rightness of his position. Richard seemed to shrink under his brother's anger, the bluster draining out of him as he recognized that he had lost not just the succession, but Alexander's respect and affection as well. He asked, more quietly now, what would happen to him, whether he would be prosecuted, whether the family name would be dragged through the courts and destroyed by scandal. Alexander told him the same thing he had told their mother. Exile, voluntary and permanent, with a modest income to support himself abroad, or trial, with all the public shame and legal consequences that would entail. Richard could choose to leave quietly, to disappear into continental society and make a life for himself there, or he could fight and be destroyed in the process. But he could not remain in England, could not continue to present himself as heir, could not have any contact with Thomas or attempt to influence his upbringing. The solicitor, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, now spoke up to confirm that these terms were generous given the circumstances, that many would argue for immediate prosecution rather than the opportunity for quiet departure. He advised Richard to accept the offer, to understand that Alexander was extending mercy where the law would not, that this was his only chance to salvage any dignity from the situation. Richard sat in silence for a long moment, his hands clenched on the arms of his chair, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion. Finally, he looked at Alexander and asked if there was truly no other way, no possibility of remaining in England, even in reduced circumstances, of maintaining some connection to the family and the life he had known. Alexander's answer was firm. He said that Richard had made his choices 5 years ago when he stood by while their mother orchestrated the conspiracy, that his silence and complicity made him as guilty as if he had held the pillow himself. There was no forgiveness for that, no reconciliation possible, only the stark choice between exile and prosecution. And he had 1 week to make his decision and leave the country, or Alexander would file charges, regardless of the scandal it would cause. Richard left the office without another word, his shoulders rigid with suppressed fury and humiliation. I felt no triumph watching him go, only a weary sadness at how completely this family had destroyed itself through ambition and cruelty, how many lives had been damaged or lost in the pursuit of power and position. Alexander stood beside me at the window, watching his brother's retreating figure, and I could feel the tension radiating from him, the cost of what he had just done. That evening, we received word that Richard had accepted the terms and would depart for the continent within days. The relief was palpable, but it was mixed with the knowledge that we had crossed a point of no return, that the Hartwell family as it had existed was truly finished, scattered to exile or the grave, leaving only Alexander and Thomas to carry the name forward. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and social maneuvering. Thomas was officially recognized as the heir, his birth and survival documented in the proper registries, his position secured beyond any challenge. Alexander began the process of reclaiming Ashford House and the estates, displacing the staff who had served his brother and installing new household management loyal to him and his vision for the family's future. And through it all, we planned our wedding, a ceremony that would formalize what everyone already knew, that I would become the Duchess of Ashford, that the governess who had fled in disgrace would return as mistress of the house she had once served. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all me. But Alexander insisted that we marry properly and publicly, that there be no hint of shame or secrecy about our union. The engagement announcement caused exactly the scandal we had anticipated. Some of society was scandalized, others intrigued, a few openly hostile to the idea of a duke marrying so far beneath his station. But Alexander faced each criticism with calm dignity, making it clear that anyone who could not accept me as his wife would not be welcome in his life or his home. It was a bold stance, and it cost him some relationships and alliances, but it also earned him respect from unexpected quarters, from those who admired his loyalty and his willingness to defy convention for the sake of love. I found myself thrust into a world I had once observed from the margins, now expected to navigate it as an equal rather than a servant. There were morning calls to make and receive, social events to attend, 1,000 unwritten rules to learn and follow. Alexander was patient with my mistakes, protective when others were unkind, but he also insisted that I not diminish myself, that I stand proud in my new position rather than apologizing for my origins. The most difficult moments came when I encountered people I had known in my previous life, other servants or former employers who now had to curtsy to me or acknowledge me as their superior. Some managed it gracefully, genuinely pleased to see me rise so dramatically. Others could barely contain their resentment or disbelief, and their thin smiles and cold greetings reminded me that I would never fully escape the stigma of my past, that there would always be those who saw me as an imposter playing at nobility. But Thomas was my anchor through all of it. His delight in having both a mother and a father, his innocent joy in the grand house and the new experiences, his complete lack of concern for social hierarchies and expectations. These things reminded me why we were fighting so hard for this new life. He deserved to grow up secure and loved, to claim his inheritance without shame, to have the opportunities that came with his position. And if securing that for him meant enduring the judgment and gossip of society, then I would endure it gladly. Our wedding was set for mid-December, a modest ceremony by ducal standards, but still far grander than anything I had ever imagined for myself. The guest list was carefully curated, including only those who had genuinely supported us and excluding the social climbers and scandal seekers who would have attended merely for the spectacle. We chose to marry at the small chapel on the Ashford estate rather than in London, a deliberate choice that emphasized family and intimacy over social display. In the weeks before the ceremony, Alexander and I worked together to transform Ashford House into something new, to cleanse it of the dark history that had stained its halls. We hired new staff, redecorated rooms that held painful memories, opened the house to light and air that had been shut out during his mother's reign. It was symbolic as much as practical, this remaking of the space, but it felt important, necessary, as though we could not build our future in rooms that still echoed with betrayal and cruelty. Thomas thrived in the grand house, exploring its many rooms and grounds with the enthusiasm of a child discovering a magical kingdom. Alexander hired tutors for him, the best available, but insisted that learning be balanced with play, that Thomas be allowed to simply be a child rather than being molded too early into the image of what a future duke should be. It was clear that Alexander was determined not to repeat the mistakes of his own upbringing, that he would give Thomas the freedom and affection that he himself had been denied. I watched them together one afternoon in the library. Thomas curled beside his father as Alexander read aloud from a book of adventures, both of them completely absorbed in the story. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, illuminating them in gold, and I thought about how impossible this scene would have seemed just months ago, how close we had come to never having this at all. The weight of that alternative reality, of the life where Thomas remained hidden and Alexander never found us, pressed down on me with sudden force. Alexander looked up and saw my expression, and without breaking the flow of the story, he extended his hand to me, inviting me to join them. I crossed the room and settled beside them on the sofa, and Thomas immediately shifted to lean against me as well, creating a small circle of warmth and connection. Alexander finished the chapter and closed the book, and we sat there in comfortable silence, the three of us, no longer fragments of broken families, but something whole and new. That evening, after Thomas was asleep, Alexander and I walked through the portrait gallery that lined one wing of the house. The faces of generations of Hartwells looked down at us, stern and proper in their gilded frames, the accumulated weight of history and expectation. Alexander stopped before a portrait of his father, a man I had never met but whose reputation for coldness and cruelty was well established. And he told me that he would not be that kind of father, that he would not let tradition and duty crush the joy out of Thomas the way it had been crushed out of him. I asked him what kind of father he wanted to be, and he smiled, that genuine warm smile that transformed his entire face. "The kind who loves his son more than his title," he said simply. "The kind who teaches him that honor means protecting those who cannot protect themselves, not just maintaining appearances. The kind who shows him that love is not weakness, but the greatest strength we have." His words were a promise and a prayer, and I loved him more in that moment than I had thought possible to love anyone. We stood there surrounded by the stern faces of his ancestors, and I understood that we were not just creating a new family, but redefining what family meant, what duty meant, what love could accomplish when it refused to bend to convention. The night before our wedding, I could not sleep. I stood at the window of my room, looking out over the frost-covered grounds of Ashford Estate, and I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From disgraced governess living in a cottage with a leaking roof to the woman who would become Duchess the next morning. It seemed impossible, the kind of story one read in novels but did not actually live, and yet here I was, on the threshold of a future I had never dared to imagine. There was a soft knock at my door, and when I opened it, I found not Alexander, who was observing the tradition of not seeing the bride before the ceremony, but Thomas, unable to sleep with excitement about the next day. He asked if he could stay with me for a while, and I invited him in, wrapping him in a blanket and settling him in the chair by the fire. He told me he was happy, that he had been afraid when Papa first revealed himself because change was frightening. But now he understood that some changes were wonderful, that having both of us together was better than he had ever dreamed. He asked me if I was nervous about becoming a duchess, and I admitted that I was, that the responsibility felt enormous, and I was not certain I was equal to it. Thomas looked at me with those serious gray eyes, so like his father's, and he said something that cut through all my anxiety and doubt. "You saved me when no one else would," he said. "You took care of me when I had no one. You are already the bravest person I know. Being a duchess will be easy compared to that." His faith in me, his simple certainty, broke something open in my chest. I pulled him into my arms and held him close. This child who was not mine by birth, but was mine by every choice that mattered, and I made a silent vow that I would be worthy of his faith, that I would be the mother and duchess he deserved, regardless of what society thought or said. Eventually he fell asleep in my arms, and I carried him back to his room and tucked him into bed, kissing his forehead and whispering a promise that everything would be all right, that we would face the future together, all three of us, and nothing would tear us apart again. When I returned to my room, I found a letter had been slipped under my door. I recognized Alexander's handwriting immediately and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single page covered in his strong, clear script. He wrote that he had been thinking about the path that brought us to this moment, about all the choices and chances and acts of courage that had been required. He wrote that he did not believe in fate or destiny, but that he believed in us, in the family we had fought for and the love we had chosen despite every obstacle. He wrote that tomorrow he would stand before witnesses and vow to love and honor me for the rest of his life, but that the vow was a formality, that in his heart he had already bound himself to me, the night I told him I would face the future with him, that nothing would ever change that commitment. The letter ended with a simple line that made tears spring to my eyes. "You gave me back my life, Eleanor. Tomorrow I give you back my name, my heart, and every tomorrow we will have together. I love you with everything I am and everything I hope to become." I read the letter 3 times, each word settling into my heart like a benediction, a promise, a future written in ink and sealed with certainty. And when I finally slept, it was with that letter pressed against my chest, with the knowledge that in the morning I would walk toward a new life, not as someone defined by what I had lost or sacrificed, but as someone who had fought for love and won, who had saved a child and found a family, who had earned her place through courage rather than birth. The morning dawned clear and cold, the winter sun brilliant against the frost, and as I prepared for the ceremony that would change my name and my position forever, I felt not fear but anticipation, not doubt but certainty, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, bound by love stronger than scandal, faith deeper than tradition, and a commitment to protect the family we had created from the ruins of what had been destroyed. The chapel was filled with winter light and the scent of hothouse roses when I walked down the aisle on the arm of the solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, who had agreed to stand in for the father I no longer had. The guests were few but genuine, people who had supported us through the scandal and turmoil, who believed in what we were building despite society's disapproval. And at the altar stood Alexander, dressed in formal black, his gray eyes fixed on me with such intensity and devotion that I felt my breath catch in my throat. Thomas stood beside his father as his attendant, beaming with pride and excitement, and when I reached them, he whispered loudly enough for the first few rows to hear that I looked like a princess from his storybooks. The comment drew gentle laughter from the assembled guests, breaking the formality of the moment, and reminding everyone that this wedding was not just about social position or scandal, but about creating a family, about 3 people who had found each other against impossible odds. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt. The vicar, an elderly man who had known Alexander since childhood and who had been quietly supportive of our union, spoke of love as a force that transcends social boundaries, of families built not just by blood but by choice and commitment, of the courage required to follow one's heart in defiance of convention. His words felt less like generic ceremony and more like a benediction on our specific journey, an acknowledgement of everything we had overcome to stand here together. When Alexander spoke his vows, his voice was steady and clear, but I could see the emotion in his eyes, the weight of what this moment meant to him. He promised to love and honor me, not just as his wife, but as the woman who had saved his son, who had shown him that redemption was possible, who had taught him that love was worth any sacrifice. He promised to stand beside me against whatever judgment or difficulty came our way, to build a life and a family worthy of the courage it had taken to get here. My own vows were harder to speak, my throat tight with emotion, but I managed to tell him that I had never imagined this future for myself, that I had expected to live out my days in obscurity with Thomas, hiding from the world that had condemned me. But he had found us, had seen past my disgrace to the truth of what I had done, and in doing so, he had given me back not just my name, but my faith in the possibility of happiness. I promised to love him with the same fierce protectiveness I had shown Thomas, to stand beside him as he rebuilt his family's legacy, to be the partner he deserved in every way that mattered. When we exchanged rings, simple gold bands inscribed with the date and our initials, I felt the weight of them as more than jewelry, as symbols of the commitment we were making before witnesses and before heaven itself. And when the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, when Alexander kissed me with a tenderness that made my heart ache, I understood that this was not an ending but a true beginning, the first page of a story we would write together. The wedding breakfast was held at Ashford House, a modest affair by aristocratic standards, but lavish compared to anything I had experienced in my previous life. The guests toasted our happiness, shared stories and wishes for our future, and treated me with a warmth that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. There were still those in society who disapproved, who whispered about the inappropriateness of the match, but they were not here, and their absence felt like a blessing rather than a loss. Thomas appointed himself the center of attention, regaling anyone who would listen with stories about Papa and Mama and how they were the best parents in all of England. His innocent enthusiasm charmed even the most reserved guests, and I could see people softening as they watched him, understanding perhaps why we had fought so hard to protect him and to give him a proper place in the world. As the afternoon faded into evening and the guests began to depart, Alexander and I finally had a moment alone in the library. He pulled me into his arms and simply held me, and I could feel the tension draining out of him, the relief of having successfully navigated this crucial milestone. We had done it. We were married, publicly and properly, and no one could question the legitimacy of our union or my position as his wife. But even in that moment of triumph, I knew that challenges remained ahead. Being the Duchess of Ashford meant more than wearing fine clothes and hosting social events. It meant managing a vast household, overseeing charitable obligations, representing the family and society, and most importantly, protecting Thomas as he grew into his role as heir. The responsibility of it was daunting, but looking up at Alexander's face, seeing the love and confidence he had in me, I felt equal to the task. The first test of my new position came sooner than expected. 3 weeks after our wedding, we received an invitation to attend a ball hosted by the Duke and Duchess of Westmoreland, one of the most influential families in England. It was clearly a gesture of acceptance, an indication that at least some of the highest echelons of society were willing to acknowledge our union and my new status. But it was also a test, an opportunity for people to observe us closely, to judge whether I could carry myself appropriately, whether Alexander's choice had been wisdom or folly. I was terrified. My experience of such grand social events had always been from the perspective of a servant, watching from the margins, never participating. Now I would be expected to move through the ballroom as an equal, to make conversation with duchesses and countesses, to represent the Ashford name with grace and dignity. The prospect of failure, of embarrassing Alexander or confirming everyone's worst assumptions about me, kept me awake at night. Alexander was patient with my anxiety, but he was also firm in his insistence that I was fully capable of meeting this challenge. He arranged for a social tutor, a kind older woman who had served as companion to several duchesses and who taught me the subtle rules of high society, the proper forms of address, the acceptable topics of conversation, the ways to navigate social hierarchies without appearing either obsequious or arrogant. It was exhausting and humbling, learning things that women born to my new station absorbed from childhood, but I was determined not to let Alexander down. The night of the ball arrived with terrifying speed. I dressed in a gown of deep blue silk, simply cut but elegant, with Alexander's mother's diamonds at my throat, a deliberate choice that signaled my legitimate position in the family. Thomas watched me prepare with wide eyes, telling me I looked like a queen, and I kissed his forehead and promised to tell him all about it when I returned. The Westmoreland ballroom was magnificent, all glittering chandeliers and polished marble, filled with the cream of English society dressed in their finest. As we entered and were announced, I felt every eye in the room turn toward us, felt the weight of their scrutiny and judgment pressing down like a physical force. But Alexander's hand was steady on my arm, and when I looked up at him, he smiled with such warmth and pride that some of my fear dissipated. We moved through the receiving line, greeting the Duke and Duchess of Westmoreland, who were gracious if somewhat reserved. The Duchess studied me with sharp eyes, assessing, but when she spoke, her words were courteous, welcoming me to their home and congratulating us on our marriage. It was not effusive warmth, but it was acceptance, and that was more than I had dared to hope for. The evening that followed was a blur of introductions and conversations, of navigating the complex dance of social interaction while trying not to appear nervous or out of place. Some people were openly curious, asking carefully phrased questions designed to probe the circumstances of our marriage. Others were coldly polite, making their disapproval clear through tone and brevity. But there were also those who were genuinely kind, who welcomed me warmly and seemed pleased that Alexander had found happiness again. The true test came when I was approached by Lady Pemberton, a woman known for her sharp tongue and her influence over social opinion. She regarded me with undisguised assessment, and I braced myself for subtle cruelty disguised as courtesy. But her first question surprised me. She asked directly how I had managed to save the child, what had possessed me to take such a risk, how I had survived 5 years in obscurity while raising the heir to a dukedom. Her tone was not cruel, but genuinely interested, as though she were trying to understand the mechanics of courage. I answered honestly, telling her that I had acted on instinct rather than calculation, that keeping Thomas safe had been the only thing that mattered, that I had never expected to be rewarded or recognized for what I had done. Lady Pemberton listened carefully, and when I finished, she said something I had not expected. She told me that she had known Alexander's first wife, Catherine, and had always believed the girl deserved better than the cold, dutiful marriage she had been given. She said that she was glad to see Alexander had learned something from that tragedy, that he had chosen to marry for love rather than obligation, and that while society might gossip and judge, there were those who admired what we had done. Her words were not quite an endorsement, but they were far from condemnation, and I felt something loosen in my chest. If Lady Pemberton, arbiter of social acceptability, was willing to give us the benefit of the doubt, then perhaps we had a chance of truly being accepted, of building a place for ourselves in this world that had seemed so determined to exclude us. As the evening progressed, I found myself relaxing into my role, conversing more naturally, even enjoying some of the interactions. Alexander stayed close, always ready to support me if needed, but increasingly he stepped back, letting me navigate on my own, showing his confidence in my ability to hold my own in this glittering, judgmental world. We danced together late in the evening, a waltz that drew the attention of the other guests. I had worried about this moment, about making some misstep that would be noted and gossiped about. But as Alexander held me and we moved through the familiar steps, I forgot about the watching eyes. There was only the music and his presence, and the knowledge that we had survived this test, that we were building something real and lasting despite every obstacle. When we returned to Ashford House near midnight, exhausted but triumphant, we found Thomas still awake, having convinced his nurse to let him wait up for us. He demanded to know every detail, and we sat with him in his bedroom, taking turns describing the ballroom and the people and the evening's events. His enthusiasm and pride in us was touching, and as I tucked him into bed finally, he whispered that he had always known we would be the very best Duke and Duchess in all of England. Over the following months, life settled into a new pattern. I learned to manage the household, to oversee the staff with authority that still felt strange but grew more natural with practice, to host dinners and make social calls and fulfill all the obligations of my position. It was not always easy, and there were moments when I felt overwhelmed by the responsibility or stung by some subtle slight from those who still considered me an upstart. But Alexander was always there, supporting and encouraging me, reminding me why we had fought for this life. Thomas continued to thrive, growing taller and more confident, excelling in his studies and showing a natural aptitude for leadership that suggested he would make an excellent duke when his time came. Alexander was a devoted father, involved in Thomas's education and upbringing in ways that were unusual for men of his class, and their bond grew stronger with each passing day. But it was not all triumph and happiness. There were still those who worked against us, who spread malicious gossip or tried to undermine my position. Anonymous letters arrived occasionally, accusing me of manipulation or social climbing, questioning Thomas's legitimacy despite all the legal documentation. Alexander dealt with these ruthlessly, making it clear that anyone who attacked his family would face his full wrath. But the persistence of the hostility was wearing. The most difficult moment came when we learned that Alexander's brother Richard had died abroad, reportedly from illness, but possibly from the despair and dissolution that had marked his exile. Alexander received the news with complicated grief, mourning not the brother Richard had become, but the boy he had once been, before ambition and their mother's influence had corrupted him. We traveled to the continent to arrange for his burial in the family plot, a gesture of forgiveness and closure that I knew cost Alexander deeply. At the grave site, with only the priest and a few servants present, Alexander spoke quietly about the waste of it all, about how his family's obsession with position and power had destroyed so many lives. He vowed that he would not let that poison continue, that Thomas would grow up understanding that titles and wealth were responsibilities rather than privileges, that true honor came from how you treated those who depended on you. I stood beside him holding his hand, and when we returned to England, I felt that we had truly closed the door on the past, that we could finally look forward without the shadow of old betrayals and conspiracies hanging over us. Spring came to Ashford, bringing with it renewal and hope. The gardens that had been neglected during the years of tragedy began to bloom again under the care of new groundskeepers. The house filled with light and laughter, with Thomas's friends visiting for lessons and play, with dinner parties and small gatherings that felt warm and genuine rather than performative. One afternoon, I stood in the newly restored morning room, watching through the window as Alexander taught Thomas to ride a new pony. The sight of them together, father and son, moving in easy harmony across the green lawn, filled me with a contentment so profound it brought tears to my eyes. This was what we had fought for, this simple domestic happiness, this family built from the ruins of tragedy. Alexander looked up and saw me watching, and he waved, his face alight with uncomplicated joy. And I waved back, thinking about the impossible journey that had brought us here, about the woman I had been when I fled this house 5 years ago with a newborn in my arms, terrified and alone, compared to the woman I was now, standing in this same house as its mistress, surrounded by love and purpose. That evening, after Thomas had gone to bed, Alexander and I walked through the portrait gallery where we had stood before our wedding. But now there was a new portrait hanging among the ancestors, a painting that Alexander had commissioned showing the three of us together, Thomas between us, all of us looking not at the viewer, but at each other, our expressions capturing the genuine affection that bound us. It was unusual, Alexander admitted, to include a child so prominently in a formal portrait, and more unusual still to show such open emotion rather than the stern formality that characterized most ducal portraits. But he wanted anyone who walked through this gallery in future years to see clearly what our family had been built on, not tradition or duty, but love chosen deliberately and defended fiercely. I studied the portrait, seeing myself captured in oil and canvas, wearing the diamonds and silk of a duchess, but with an expression that was purely my own, that of a woman who had fought for her family and won. And I understood that this was Alexander's gift to me, this permanent record that I belonged here, that my place in this family and in this history was not contingent or temporary, but absolute and unassailable. We stood there hand in hand, two people who had found each other in the darkness, who had built something beautiful from the wreckage of what had come before, and I knew that whatever challenges still lay ahead, we would face them together. Bound by vows spoken before witnesses and by the deeper promises we made to each other every day through our actions and choices, an unwavering commitment to the family we had created. 2 years had passed since our wedding, and the life we had built at Ashford felt as solid and real as the ancient stones of the estate itself. Thomas was 7 now, tall for his age and quick-witted, showing all the promise of the man he would one day become. He divided his time between rigorous studies with his tutors and the freedom to simply be a child, exploring the grounds, playing with the children from the village, learning to be both a future duke and a kind, curious human being. The scandal that had surrounded our marriage had not disappeared entirely, but it had faded into the background, overtaken by newer gossip and dramas. We had proven ourselves through consistent dignity and genuine devotion to our responsibilities, and most of society had grudgingly accepted that the Duke of Ashford and his unconventional Duchess were here to stay. Those who could not accept us simply excluded us from their circles, and we found that we did not miss their company. What surprised me most about this new life was how completely I had grown into it, how natural it felt to manage the vast household, to oversee the charitable work that fell to the Duchess, to move through society with confidence rather than the terror that had marked those early months. I was still the woman who had hidden in a cottage with a stolen child, but I was also now someone who could command a staff of 50, who could discuss estate management with the stewards, who could hold her own in conversation with the most educated and powerful women in England. But the greatest gift of these 2 years was watching Alexander transform from the grief-stricken man who had returned in disguise to someone who had found peace and purpose. He was an attentive father, a devoted husband, and a responsible duke who took seriously his obligations to the land and the people who depended on him. The coldness that had marked him in his first marriage, the distance that had made him seem unreachable, had melted away completely. He laughed easily now, played with Thomas without concern for dignity, and showed me daily through 1,000 small gestures that his love had not faded but deepened with familiarity. It was spring again when we received unexpected news that would bring our journey full circle. A letter arrived from Italy, from the convent where Alexander's mother had retreated after leaving England. The Dowager Duchess was gravely ill, the nuns wrote, and had expressed a wish to see her son and grandson before she died. It was not a demand or an expectation, merely a request, and Alexander was free to refuse without consequence or judgment. I watched him read the letter, saw the complicated emotions play across his face. This was the woman who had orchestrated the conspiracy to kill his son, who had driven us into hiding, who had nearly destroyed everything we held dear. By all rights, he should have no desire to grant her final request, no obligation to provide her with comfort or closure. And yet, I could see him struggling with it, with the weight of their shared history and the question of what mercy and forgiveness truly meant. He asked me what I thought, whether I could bear to see her again, whether it was fair to Thomas to bring him into the presence of the grandmother who had tried to erase his existence. I told him honestly that I did not know. That part of me wanted nothing to do with her, wanted her to die alone, with her sins unabsolved. But another part of me understood that carrying hatred and anger forever was its own kind of prison, that perhaps there was freedom in facing her one final time and choosing to let go of the bitterness that still occasionally haunted my dreams. We decided together to make the journey, to bring Thomas with us so that he could meet his grandmother and make his own judgments about her, so that he would understand the full story of his family rather than growing up with gaps and mysteries. It felt important that he see where he came from, even the ugly parts, so that he could consciously choose what kind of man and what kind of duke he wanted to become. The journey to Italy was long but not unpleasant. Thomas was fascinated by everything: the ships and foreign ports, the different languages and customs, the mountains and ancient cities we passed through. Alexander and I used the time to talk with him carefully about his grandmother, about what she had done and why, about the complicated truth that people could love and harm at the same time, that understanding did not mean excusing, but it did mean seeing the full humanity of even those who had committed terrible acts. The convent was peaceful, set among olive groves and flowering gardens, a place of quiet contemplation, far removed from the political intrigues and ambitions that had driven the Dowager Duchess through most of her life. The nuns greeted us with gentle courtesy and led us to a small room where she waited, propped up in bed, visibly diminished by illness, but still retaining something of the formidable presence I remembered. She looked first at Alexander, and I saw tears spring to her eyes, genuine emotion breaking through the careful control she had always maintained. She told him she was sorry, that she had been wrong, that her ambition and pride had poisoned everything she touched. The words came haltingly, as though confession was a foreign language she was learning too late, but they seemed sincere, drawn from some deep place of regret and recognition of the harm she had caused. Then she looked at Thomas, who stood between Alexander and me, holding both our hands, his young face serious and curious. She studied him intently, taking in every feature, every resemblance to her son and her late daughter-in-law, and fresh tears tracked down her withered cheeks. She told him he was beautiful, that he looked like his mother, that she had been wrong to fear his existence, that he was clearly blessed to have a father who loved him and a mother who had been brave enough to save him. The word mother, applied to me, hung in the air between us. I had not expected her to acknowledge me at all, much less to validate my role in Thomas's life. But when she turned her gaze to me, there was something like respect in her expression, grudging but genuine. She said my name, Eleanor, and told me that she had spent 2 years in this convent thinking about what I had done, about the courage it had taken to defy her and to risk everything for a child that was not mine by blood. She said she had been raised to believe that position and power were what mattered, that maintaining appearances and securing succession were the highest goods. But watching me now, seeing the family we had built, she understood that she had been wrong about everything that truly mattered. She said she did not expect forgiveness, did not deserve it, but wanted me to know that she recognized the magnitude of what I had accomplished and was grateful, in her way, that I had been strong enough to do what was right when she had chosen to do what was expedient. Her words were not quite an apology, but they were an acknowledgement, and I found that they meant something to me despite everything. I told her that I had made my choices for Thomas, not for her approval or gratitude, but that I appreciated her honesty now, at the end. I told her that I hoped she found peace in this place, that she could let go of the ambitions and fears that had driven her to such cruelty. Thomas, with the directness of children, asked her why she had wanted him gone, why she had tried to hurt him when he was just a baby. The question was stark and painful, and I saw her flinch from it. But she answered him honestly, telling him that she had been afraid, that his father had been unhappy in his first marriage, and she feared he would not be a strong duke if burdened with a child and a grief he could not overcome. She had thought wrongly that erasing him would allow Alexander to start fresh, to remarry strategically and produce heirs without the complications of his first family. She had not understood, she said, that what she thought was protecting the family was actually destroying it, that strength came from love rather than calculated strategy. It was a child's honesty that prompted her most revealing admission. Thomas asked simply if she loved them, if she had ever loved his father, or if she had only cared about the dukedom. And she answered, after a long silence, that she had loved Alexander in her way, but that she had loved her vision of what he should be more than who he actually was, and that this failure of imagination had been her greatest sin. She told Thomas to love people as they truly were, not as he wished them to be, and to understand that real strength meant protecting the vulnerable rather than sacrificing them for abstract ideals. We stayed for an hour, and by the end of it, the atmosphere in the room had shifted from tension to something gentler. Not quite reconciliation, but at least mutual understanding. When we rose to leave, the Dowager Duchess asked if she might hold Thomas's hand for a moment, and he looked to me for permission before stepping forward. She clasped his small hand in her frail one and told him to be a good man before he was a great duke, to remember that titles were temporary, but the impact we have on others' lives echoes through generations. Then she looked at Alexander and asked if he could forgive her, not for her sake, but for his own, so that he would not carry the weight of her sins alongside his own burdens. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with emotions too complex to easily name. Finally, he told her that he forgave her because holding on to anger had nearly destroyed him once already, and he refused to let it poison the life he had built with us. His forgiveness was not absolution of her crimes, he said, but release of his own need for vengeance, and that would have to be enough. We left the convent that afternoon, and the Dowager Duchess died 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep according to the letter we received weeks later. Alexander arranged for her burial in the family plot at Ashford, not in the grand mausoleum where his father rested, but in a quieter corner of the cemetery, marked with a simple stone that bore her name and dates with no additional inscription. It seemed fitting, this modest ending for a woman who had spent her life grasping for grandeur and power. The journey to and from Italy had been cathartic in ways I had not anticipated. Facing her, hearing her admissions and regrets, had allowed me to finally let go of the fear that had shadowed me for years, the terror that somehow she would return and take Thomas away or destroy what we had built. She was gone now, and with her went the last vestiges of the conspiracy that had nearly torn our family apart before it could begin. We returned to Ashford as summer was beginning, and the estate had never looked more beautiful, the gardens in full bloom, the fields green and productive, the house filled with the sounds of normal life rather than secrets and shadows. Thomas ran ahead of us as we walked from the carriage, eager to see his pony and his dogs and to tell the staff about all his adventures abroad. And Alexander and I followed more slowly, hand in hand, taking in the sight of our home and our life with profound gratitude. That evening, after Thomas was in bed, Alexander and I sat in the library where so much of our story had unfolded, where we had first talked as William Gray, the chauffeur, and Eleanor, the woman hiding from her past. He told me that he had been thinking about everything we had overcome, about the impossible path that had led us here, and that he wanted me to know how completely his life had been transformed by knowing me, by loving me, by building this family with me. I told him that I felt the same, that the woman I had been when I fled this house with a newborn in my arms could never have imagined becoming who I was now, that his love had given me not just a title and security, but genuine confidence in my own worth and capabilities. We had saved each other, I said, just as surely as we had saved Thomas. And that seemed like the truest kind of love there was, the kind that made both people stronger and better than they could be alone. We talked into the night about the future, about Thomas's education and the kind of man we hoped he would become, about the changes we wanted to make to the estate and the ways we could use our position to help those who had far less. We talked about the possibility of more children, siblings for Thomas, who would grow up knowing only love and security, who would help carry on the new legacy we were building. And we talked about growing old together, about the life we would share across decades, about the grandchildren we might one day watch playing in these same gardens. It was not a conversation marked by grand declarations or dramatic promises. It was simply two people who had fought hard for their happiness, now allowing themselves to believe in it fully, to plan for a future that no longer felt precarious or contingent, but solid and earned. And there was profound peace in that, in the knowledge that we had not just survived our trials, but had truly triumphed over them. The following week, we hosted a gathering at Ashford, inviting friends and neighbors to celebrate Thomas's 8th birthday. It was a joyful event, filled with children's laughter and games on the lawn, with adults relaxing in the summer warmth and enjoying good food and conversation. Watching Thomas surrounded by friends, seeing him confident and happy and completely secure in his identity and his place in the world, I felt the final piece of my long journey settling into place. Lady Pemberton, who had become an unexpected friend and ally, approached me as the afternoon was winding down. She told me she had been wrong about me initially, had thought I was an opportunist who had manipulated circumstances to my advantage. But watching our family over the past 2 years, seeing the genuine love and respect between Alexander and me, witnessing the way Thomas thrived under our care, she had come to understand that what we had was rare and precious, that it transcended the usual calculations of society and title. She said something then that stayed with me long after the party ended. She told me that most people in our world married for position, for money, for family alliances, and if they were lucky, they found some affection along the way. But we had done it backwards, had married for love despite every practical obstacle, and in doing so had built something that felt more real and lasting than all the carefully arranged unions in England. We had earned our happiness, she said, and we deserved to enjoy it without guilt or apology. Her words were a gift, a validation from someone whose opinion carried weight in the society that had once rejected me. But more than that, they were confirmation of what I had slowly come to believe, that the path we had chosen, difficult as it had been, was the right one, that fighting for love and truth and family was always worth whatever cost it demanded. As evening fell and the last guests departed, Alexander and I stood on the terrace watching the sun set over the Ashford lands. Thomas was inside being prepared for bed by his nurse, exhausted and happy from his birthday celebration. The house behind us glowed with warm light, and the garden stretched out before us, peaceful and beautiful in the fading day. Alexander wrapped his arms around me from behind, and we stood there in comfortable silence, two people who no longer needed constant words to communicate what we meant to each other. I thought about the woman I had been that desperate night 5 years ago, running through dark hallways with a newborn, terrified and alone. And I thought about who I was now, standing here as the Duchess of Ashford, secure in my position and my worth, surrounded by love I had earned through courage and sacrifice. The journey from there to here had been impossible, implausible, the kind of transformation that happened in stories but rarely in real life. And yet here we were, living proof that sometimes, against all odds, fighting for what was right could lead not just to survival, but to genuine triumph, to happiness earned rather than inherited, to a love that was all the stronger for having been tested by fire. I turned in Alexander's arms to face him, and in his eyes I saw my own wonder and gratitude reflected back at me. We had been given a second chance, all three of us, an opportunity to build something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed, and we had not wasted it. We had created a family bound not by duty or obligation, but by choice and devotion, by daily recommitment to loving each other through whatever challenges arose. He kissed me gently, and then we walked back into the house together, into the life we had fought for and won, into the future we would build one day at a time with Thomas and whatever children might join us, into the story we were still writing with every choice we made to be brave, to be kind, to stand together against anything that threatened what we had created. The past was behind us, its shadows finally fading into memory rather than threat. The future stretched ahead, full of possibility and promise, awaiting our next chapter. And the present, this moment, standing in our home with our son sleeping safely upstairs and our love tested and proven through every imaginable trial, this present was more than I had ever dared to dream possible. I had set out to save one child and had somehow saved myself in the process, had found not just security but genuine happiness, had discovered that love could triumph over scandal and convention when it was rooted in courage and unwavering commitment. And looking at the life we had built, the family we had become, the future we faced together, I understood that every sacrifice, every difficult choice, every moment of fear and uncertainty had been worth it for this, for the profound joy of loving and being loved, for the chance to raise Thomas in safety and truth, for the privilege of growing old beside the man who had seen past my disgrace to the woman I truly was. This was our story, mine and Alexander's and Thomas's, a tale of rescue and redemption, of love chosen in defiance of society's rules, of a family forged in adversity and strengthened by every challenge overcome. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Ashford, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it as we had faced everything, together, bound by vows spoken and promises kept, by love that had proven itself stronger than fear, more enduring than scandal, more powerful than all the forces that had tried to tear us apart. We had won, not just survived, but truly won, claimed the happiness we deserved, and built a foundation for generations to come. And standing there in the twilight, with Alexander's hand in mine and our son safe in his bed and the life we had created surrounding us in every direction, I felt a peace so complete, a contentment so profound, that it seemed to encompass everything I had ever hoped for, and more than I had ever believed possible. This was our beginning and our ending, our struggle and our triumph, our story told in full and complete, a testament to the power of courage and the enduring strength of love that refuses to surrender, refuses to compromise, refuses to be anything less than exactly what it is, fierce and devoted and absolutely unbreakable.